So everyone has decided that a skin cell is the biggest, but it's kind of a question of this virus adenine RNA polymerase, what order they are in. So I want to talk about some strategies when you are going through thinking about these types of questions. So first of all, you want to think about so the biggest things that we generally talk about in biology that are still things you can't see. I imagine once we hit things that you can see, you've got a pretty good idea of what's bigger than what. So it really starts getting tricky when we get below like the grain of rice and grain of salt, right, into the microscopic and submicroscopic world. So the first thing to ask yourself is the object a cell? The cells are pretty much the biggest thing that we're going to be working with in this class, aside from organisms. So if the object is a bacteria cell, a yeast cell, a human cell, a plant cell, an amoeba, prokaryotes are much smaller than eukaryotes. So you can ask yourself that question. So if it's, for example, a bacteria cell, which is a prokaryote, versus a human cell, we're eukaryotes, the human cell is going to be bigger than the bacterial cell. Next, you want to think about, does it go inside a cell? And the biggest thing inside cells are organelles. So is it membrane bound, like a mitochondrion or chloroplast or the nucleus? They're going to be smaller than a cell because they're inside a cell, but bigger than the things that are inside them. So what goes inside an organelle? And these are also inside cells, but the next thing would be a collection of molecules. And so those are, for example, a chromosome. Chromosomes are mostly DNA, but they are wrapped around proteins to make them more condensed so that they fit inside cells. Another couple examples of collections of molecules that you saw in your homework was a virus, like SARS-CoV-2, and the ribosome. And then is it, once we're below collection of molecules, once we're down to single molecules, the question is it a big molecule? And we're going to be talking about the major classes of biological macromolecules in a second. So is it a big polymer, or is it a single small molecule or one of the pieces that make up a bigger molecule? So for example, a piece of DNA is going to be made up of nucleotides. A protein is going to be made up of amino acids. And so DNA and proteins are the big molecules, but still single molecules, not collections. And then we have what is smaller than them is what are the building blocks of those types of molecules. And then water, for example, is a very small molecule. You've probably heard H2O. So H2O means that there's 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. It's a very small molecule. It has only 3 atoms. It should have been the second smallest on your size and scale, and then the smallest would have been a carbon atom, because the only thing smaller than a molecule is an atom. So I think it might help if you can, especially if you're a visual learner, to think about since cells are something that are too small for us to see, it helps to think about them in your imagination. So right now I want you to close your eyes and I want you to picture yourself inside a cell. I want you to think about what would it feel like? What would you see? What things around you would you be seeing floating by, and how big would they be? So first of all, what would you hear? So cells are primarily made up of water. So it would probably sound a lot like you're underwater. You would probably hear kind of some humming and buzzing with all of the protein molecular machines whirring around and moving around. What would it feel like? So if you were inside a cell, you could feel it would be wet. Cells are, like I said, mostly water. You could maybe feel the proteins, which would be a little bit probably harder. If you could feel the outside of the cell or any of the membranes, they would probably feel soft and maybe a little buttery because they're made up of lipids. So if you imagine that you are in the mission church, let's think about how big some of the things inside the cells might be. So the nucleus could be the size of a classroom, inside the mission church. The mitochondria would be kind of like a life raft, like one of those big blow up floaty ones. You could imagine one of those floating on by. The ribosomes are much smaller. They'd be like the size of golf balls, little machines, kind of like little, you imagine like a little golf ball Pac-Man running around looking for RNA molecules to translate into proteins. Proteins are even smaller than ribosomes. There's a fair amount of range in the size of proteins, but you could think about them as the size of a marble or a marble fruit if you prefer. And then water molecules would be the size of poppy seeds, so even smaller, maybe even smaller than a poppy seed, maybe closer to like a grain of salt. So I would recommend when you're thinking about these molecules, when you get asked about, what type of molecule is this, how big is this, this is to encourage you to make pictures in your mind of these biological molecules and items. It's really easy to just kind of think of all these things as things you can't see and just kind of memorize what they are and what they do. But I think if you can kind of picture the inside of a cell and what it looks like and what it feels like, you'll have a better time kind of getting an idea for what these things do. And so one of the misconceptions that I saw coming up on your homeworks that I want you to try and actively fight is that things that are important are bigger. So a lot of people in your initial ordering put the SARS-CoV-2 virus all the way up at the top because they're like, wow, this thing has such a huge effect on our community. It must be huge. It's really important. But that's not the way it works at all. I think a lot of people are quite surprised to find out how small viruses are. They're really tiny. They're very efficient little buggers. They're really just a chunk of either DNA or RNA surrounded in some proteins and maybe some lipids. That's it. They're about the size of a ribosome. They're super small. So in that line, here's what I said about making pictures. Oh, and here's another tip. Don't memorize these things. The idea is not for you to memorize the order. It's for you to use this as a tool of problem solving in biology. So if you were to see this sort of thing, say on an exam question, I'm not going to ask you what's bigger, adenine or methionine, but you should recognize that those are both molecules and they're subunits of larger molecules. So if I asked you what's bigger, methionine or a protein, you should know that a protein is bigger because it's built of amino acids like methionine. So that's kind of the level of granularity that you should be aware of when you're coming across these biological molecules. If you liked the Size and Scale website, here's one that goes not only small, but also big. It goes all the way up to the cosmological scale. So that's kind of fun. You can check out this website too. Okay, so I want to talk about size and scale for SARS-CoV-2. So I added a couple of important pieces of this COVID-19 puzzle. So SARS-CoV-2, you probably found, is around 100 nanometers in diameter. It's smaller than a cell. It's smaller than an organelle. It's smaller than a bacterium. It's around the size of a ribosome. It's bigger than a protein, bigger than some small pieces of DNA, but not like an X chromosome has way more DNA than a virus does, for example. When I asked you about N95 masks, it was kind of a tricky question. It's not really that N95 masks have holes in them per se. but it's more about the size particle that they can stop. So the 95 on an N95 mask means that it can stop 95% of particles that are larger than 300 nanometers. So that means that if you just had free-floating virus in the air, it could go right on through, or a lot of it would end up going right through an N95 mask. The good news is that this virus is not what's considered airborne. An airborne virus means that the virus can float by itself in the air, which is not the case for SARS-CoV-2. SARS is only going to be in the air if it's in an aerosolized droplet. So if you are talking or yelling or breathing hard or coughing, all of these things release aerosols into the air. The size of aerosolized particles is actually really variable. It can be really, really small, from like micrometers all the way up to getting close to a millimeter. But the average size of an aerosolized droplet is about 10,000 nanometers. So about 100 times bigger than the SARS virus in diameter. So really what N95 masks are really good at stopping is these aerosolized droplets, which is good because if the virus is floating around in the air, it's going to be because it's in an aerosolized droplet. So surgical masks now, they are super variable, which is why they're not considered to be protective against the virus. They're really only going to stop the biggest aerosolized droplets. And then cloth masks, again, are really all the information I could find on these were that they are about half as effective as surgical masks. And this is even more variable because it depends what type of cloth you're making your mask out of and how many layers of cloth you have. But they're in the ballpark of 50% as effective as surgical masks, which are 10 to 90% as effective as an N95 mask, which still doesn't filter out everything. So cloth masks are going to stop something like 5 to 50%, 5 to 45% of these aerosolized droplets. So really, they're only going to stop the biggest ones, which is why cloth masks are not meant to protect you from aerosolized droplets floating in the air. They're meant to protect others from your aerosolized droplets. So the droplets are going to be the biggest as soon as they come out of your mouth. After they come out of your mouth, they're going to start evaporating and getting smaller and smaller. They're going to start falling to the ground. That's where the 6 feet of distance comes from. If you're just talking normally, your aerosolized droplets are going to fall to the ground about 6 feet away from you, no more than 6 feet away from you. So the point of the mask is to keep the majority of those droplets from even getting 6 feet away. And that's why the CDC is now recommending that we wear masks when we can't maintain the 6 feet of distance between each other. So for example, when you have to go out to a grocery store or something. And the reason for that is that they will protect others from you. In the case that you're someone who is pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic carrying COVID-19. And you'll have a chance to look, if you haven't yet, and when you get into lab 1, about what that timeline is from when a person gets infected to when they start showing symptoms. We have more and more and more data coming out now about how many people are asymptomatic, and it seems like it's actually really high. Like it could be up to 80% of people who get the virus show absolutely no symptoms, but they can still be transmitting it to other people. So it's really important for those types of people to be wearing cloth masks when they go outside. It of course would be even better if you could wear a surgical mask, but the issue is that right now we have such a shortage of those. They're needed much more by the health professionals than by us. So we can't use those. Cloth masks are going to be effective enough at keeping us from spreading the virus to other people. So a few notes on masks. So the first one I said is they're to protect others from you. But the other key thing is if the mask is not sealed tightly around your face, all of your breath with all of your aerosols and the virus will just pass through the gaps, especially around the nose in your mask. So if you think about the holes in an N95 mask, we're saying they're, in the area of 300 nanometers. If you can see between your cheek and the mask, it's going to be a number of millimeters, right? That is orders and orders and orders of magnitude bigger than the aerosolized spit droplet. So you can be getting all sorts of those outside of the mask. So when you're wearing a mask, it's very important that it seals tightly all the way around your face. The other thing is that the masks will keep some viruses from getting into your nose and mouth. So you have to imagine that the outside of the mask is covered in viruses, or you have to assume that. It may or may not be, depending on what you've come in contact with. But you never, ever, ever want to touch the outside of the mask once you've worn it out. So when you're taking off a mask, you want to only touch it by the ear flaps. And then if it's cloth mask, you want to put it directly into the laundry. If it's a disposable mask, straight into the garbage. And then again, you want to be careful when you're doing the laundry to not just grab the mask with your hand when you put it in the washing machine, right? Because then you're just going to get the viruses on your hand. So you may want to think about putting it in a secondary bag or in a pillowcase, and then washing your hands after you take it off, after you come back inside, after you put the clothes in the laundry. The good news is that the detergent in your laundry machine is going to totally destroy the virus. So once you get it out of the washer, then you're in good shape. Okay, so let's move on now so that was size and scale. So I want to tell you now about some of the types of molecules that I think a lot of you had the most trouble with because you're the least familiar with. So there are 4 major classes of biological macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Carbohydrates, you're probably pretty familiar with. Those are sugars and starches. They're energy as far as the cell is concerned. They're ways of storing energy in a pretty accessible way for the cells. We aren't going to talk too much about carbohydrates in this section of the class, but we'll get into them in the transformations of energy and matter section. We're going to be getting into proteins quite a bit now. Proteins are, in my opinion, the most exciting class of biological macromolecules. They are my favorite. And that's because they do stuff. They are the machines of the cell. They get stuff done. So this protein here is, this is a picture of what hemoglobin might look like if we could see it. Proteins are actually too small for a wavelength of light to hit them. So the way our eyes work is we see things that light bounces off of. Proteins are actually smaller than a wavelength of light, so it's not possible to see them with our eyes. But if we could imagine they might look something like this because they're made up of atoms, and each of these little balls is an atom. So when you think of protein, you often think of muscles. The proteins that make your muscles, proteins are responsible for your muscles being able to contract. And muscles do contain quite a lot of proteins, but all of your cells contain proteins. Any living thing makes proteins. The proteins are the things that make the organisms alive and function. Nucleic acids are the molecules that store the information on how to make proteins. We're going to be getting into this quite a bit very shortly. So there are 2 major types of nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, and we talk about them in A's, C's, T's, and G's. Those A's, C's, T's, and G's are nucleic acids, and they are the subunits of DNA and RNA polymers. And then finally, lipids are They're fatty. They're what make up the membranes in cells. So for prokaryotes, that's just the outside, but for eukaryotes, that's the outside of the cell and then also the outside of all of the organelles in the cell. Lipids are also used for longer term energy storage than carbohydrates. Cholesterol and fats are examples of lipids. We won't be talking about lipids too much in this class. Okay, so I want you to take a crack at this clicker question one more time. So we've shifted a few more people to E, but a couple are still on B and D. So let's talk about how we want to think about these guys. So pretty much everyone's in agreement that the skin cell is the biggest, the water molecule is the smallest. And so then our questions are the virus, adenine, and RNA polymerase. So the virus, we know, is a collection of molecules. So it's smaller than the skin cell, but it's going to be bigger than any individual molecule. Adenine is a nucleic acid, so it's one of the building blocks of DNA and RNA. So it's going to be smaller than the macromolecules, but bigger than an atom or a small molecule like water. And then RNA polymerase is probably what's giving people some trouble. So RNA polymerase is a protein. I'm going to give you a tip. Any molecule that ends in ACE, ASE, is an enzyme, which is, for the most part, and an enzyme is a protein. So enzymes are proteins that catalyze chemical reactions. They do stuff. So RNA polymerase is confusingly not a nucleic acid. It is a protein. It is an enzyme that polymerizes or builds RNA. So RNA polymerase is a protein. So that's going to be a big macromolecule. So it's going to be bigger than a subunit. So, but smaller than a collection of molecules. So RNA polymerase is smaller than a virus, which is a collection of molecules, but it's bigger than adenine, which is a single nucleic acid, which is a building block. It's a smaller molecule. So I would agree with the people who chose E, which is skin cell, which is a cell, a virus, which is a collection of molecules, RNA polymerase, which is a protein because it ends in ACE. And so that's a large molecule. And then adenine, which is a subunit, a monomer, you could say, a monomer of a polymer. It's a smaller molecule. And then the water molecule is the smallest. It's only 3 atoms big.